The High Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 12th to the 14th century, was a transformative period in European history. This era witnessed the consolidation of the feudal system, which had emerged in the aftermath of the collapse of the Carolingian Empire. Society was rigidly hierarchical, with a clear division between the nobility, clergy, and peasants. The vast majority of the population in Western Europe, particularly in France and England, were peasants bound to the land under the rule of local lords. These peasants, known as serfs, were legally tied to the estates they worked on and had little to no freedom. They owed labor and various forms of tribute to their lord, who, in return, offered protection and access to land. This system deeply entrenched social inequality and left the peasantry at the mercy of both secular lords and the church, which dominated not just religious but also political and social life during this period. The political landscape of Western Europe during this time was shaped by the fragmentation of power. The once mighty Carolingian Empire had fractured into smaller, competing entities, paving the way for the rise of powerful kingdoms such as France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. In France, the Capetian kings gradually extended their control over the country, though much of the land was still dominated by semi-independent lords. In England, the aftermath of the Norman conquest of 1066 brought significant changes to the political and social structures, blending Anglo-Saxon and Norman traditions under a powerful monarchy. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire, while vast in size, was a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, and principalities that owed nominal allegiance to the emperor but operated with considerable autonomy. These powers, though often at odds with each other, shared a common reliance on the feudal system to maintain their authority. The church was the single most influential institution during the High Middle Ages, with its influence permeating every aspect of life. It controlled vast amounts of land and wealth, collected tithes from the populace, and played a pivotal role in the governance of the kingdoms. The church not only dominated religious practices but also provided the intellectual and cultural framework of the era. Christianity shaped the worldview of medieval society, dictating moral values, social norms, and even political policies. Monasteries and cathedrals were centers of learning, where monks and clerics preserved ancient texts, engaged in theological debates, and slowly expanded knowledge in fields like philosophy, medicine, and the natural sciences. However, the dissemination of knowledge was restricted, and education was largely reserved for the clergy and the nobility. Universities began to emerge, with places like the University of Paris and Oxford becoming early centers of scholastic learning, but these were still predominantly clerical institutions. Culturally, the period saw a flowering of Gothic architecture, with the construction of monumental cathedrals such as Notre Dame de Paris and Chartres Cathedral. These buildings not only reflected religious devotion but also served as tangible expressions of the church's wealth and power. At the same time, chivalric values began to take hold among the nobility, promoting ideals of knighthood, honor, and courtly love, as exemplified in literary works like the Arthurian legends. The Crusades also played a significant role during this era, as European powers embarked on religiously motivated campaigns in the Holy Land, further intertwining the church with secular politics. In the midst of this grandeur, the daily life of a peasant was harsh and unforgiving. While the nobility and clergy enjoyed privileges and material comfort, the serfs toiled in the fields, their lives shaped by the agricultural calendar and the demands of their lords. The feudal contract was one of mutual obligation, but it was heavily skewed in favor of the upper classes. In times of good harvests, peasants could maintain a meager subsistence, but in years of famine or war, their existence became precarious. Disease, malnutrition, and high mortality rates were constants in the lives of the lower classes, who had little hope of social mobility or improved conditions. The High Middle Ages were a period marked by significant political, social, and religious developments. Western Europe saw the entrenchment of feudalism, the dominance of the church, and the rise of powerful kingdoms that would shape the future of the continent. While intellectual and cultural life began to slowly evolve, the lives of the vast majority remained deeply entrenched in poverty and toil, dictated by the rhythms of the land and the whims of their lords. The protagonist is an anonymous peasant, a nameless figure who represents the countless millions of serfs who lived and died in silence, their lives shaped by the relentless demands of feudal society. This character's anonymity is intentional. It symbolizes the mass of medieval peasants who labored under the oppressive structures of lordship and the church, without any individual recognition or voice in the annals of history. He is a serf, bound to the land, and his entire existence is dictated by the needs of his lord and the rhythms of the agricultural seasons. His motivation is simple yet profound: survival. Each day is a battle to provide for his family and to fulfill the obligations imposed upon him by the feudal system. The character struggles with back-breaking labor, a deep sense of injustice, and a quiet, simmering resentment towards a world that offers him no escape from his fate. Despite this, he holds onto a glimmer of hope for a better future for his children, though he knows it may be in vain. The antagonists in this story are multifaceted, representing not just individuals but the overwhelming systems and forces that crush the peasant under their weight. At the forefront is the feudal lord, who embodies local oppression. He is a distant figure, rarely seen by the protagonist, yet his presence is felt in every aspect of the peasant's life. The lord owns the land, controls the harvest, and demands his due in labor and taxes. To the peasant, the lord is both a necessary protector and a ruthless exploiter, whose wealth and comfort are built on the toil of those beneath him. Next is the tax collector, an agent of both the church and the state, who arrives periodically to demand the peasant's meager earnings. He represents not just financial oppression but the unrelenting hand of authority, from which there is no reprieve. Every visit by the tax collector is a moment of fear and dread, as failure to meet his demands can lead to severe punishment, such as fines, imprisonment, or even the confiscation of what little the peasant owns. Beyond these human antagonists, nature itself plays a crucial role. The harsh climate, unpredictable famine, and deadly diseases serve as constant threats, exacerbating the already difficult life of the medieval peasant. In a world without modern medicine or safety nets, a bad harvest or an outbreak of illness could mean starvation, ruin, or death. His family, a wife and children, are central to his life. His wife works alongside him in the fields, just as burdened by the feudal obligations. Their relationship is one of partnership, bonded by shared hardship, though strained by the constant pressure of survival. The children, depending on their age, either help with simple tasks or are seen as future workers who will one day bear the same yoke. These family dynamics highlight the intergenerational cycle of poverty and servitude that traps the peasant class. Other peasants in the village serve to mirror and amplify the protagonist's struggles, each grappling with the same challenges, though some may have resigned to their fate while others nurture quiet rebellion. These secondary peasants may include a village elder, who recalls the days before even heavier taxes were imposed, and a younger laborer, full of frustration but unsure of how to act against such entrenched oppression. A key figure in the village is the local priest, who serves as a spiritual guide but is also an extension of the church's authority. He offers the peasantry comfort through religion, promising eternal salvation in exchange for obedience and faith. He is not an evil character, but his role is conflicted. On one hand, he provides hope and mediates the peasant's relationship with God. On the other, he is a reminder of the church's power over their lives, as the peasants must pay tithes and follow the church's moral dictates. The priest may also struggle internally with his position, sympathizing with the peasant's plight but unable to challenge the system that upholds his own livelihood and position of relative comfort within the village hierarchy. After his victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William fundamentally transformed England's social and political landscape, consolidating the feudal system that would govern for centuries. His conquest brought about the Domesday Book, a meticulous record of landholding and resources, which allowed him to assert control over the nobility and the peasantry alike. The anonymous peasant in the story, though far removed from the royal court, is directly affected by the policies and land redistribution that William enforced. The Norman yoke weighed heavily on the English peasantry, and William's consolidation of power over England symbolizes the broader, almost inescapable power structures that dominated medieval life. By referencing William, the narrative ties the personal struggles of one peasant to the sweeping historical forces that shaped the era, highlighting how even the most remote villages felt the effects of dynastic power struggles and military conquest. The story begins at the break of dawn in a small, mist-covered village nestled in the rolling countryside. The sun is just beginning to rise, casting a pale, golden light over the fields and thatched cottages. The scene is quiet, save for the distant sound of birds and the occasional lowing of cows from the nearby barn. The protagonist, a weathered peasant with dirt-streaked hands and calloused feet, emerges from his humble cabin. The cabin itself is a simple structure, made of rough wooden beams and straw, with smoke lazily curling from the chimney as the last embers of the night's fire die out. Inside, his wife stirs, preparing a meager breakfast of coarse bread and thin broth for their children, still asleep under worn woolen blankets. The peasant steps outside, squinting at the faint rays of sunlight that promise another long, grueling day of labor. His back aches from years of toiling in the fields, bending over plows and scythes, but there is no time for rest. The fields surrounding the village stretch far into the horizon, divided into long, neat strips of land, each belonging to a different lord or to the church, with very little owned by the peasants themselves. The land looks fertile, but it is hard-earned,
won only by the sweat and toil of the village's inhabitants, who must work endlessly to survive. As the protagonist trudges toward the field, he is joined by other villagers, similarly dressed in ragged tunics and worn boots. They walk in silence, each absorbed in the weight of their own struggles. The tools they carry are primitive: wooden plows, rusted scythes, and sickles, barely enough to make their work efficient, yet essential for the survival of their families. The air is thick with the earthy smell of dew-soaked grass and freshly turned soil, a reminder of the endless cycle of planting, harvesting, and paying dues. This is the peasant's world, a place of hard labor and little reward, where every sunrise brings the same endless grind, with no hope for escape. The peacefulness of the morning is soon shattered by the toll of the village bell, a reminder that time is not their own. The bell signals the start of the day's work, and the peasants quicken their pace, knowing that the Lord's steward will soon arrive to oversee their progress. For the protagonist, this morning is no different from any other. Another day of back-breaking labor, of working land that does not belong to him, of fulfilling the endless demands of his feudal lord. The opening scene sets the stage for the oppressive nature of the protagonist's life, where even the beauty of the countryside is overshadowed by the harsh realities of survival in the feudal system. As the protagonist reaches the field, the feudal conflict becomes immediately apparent. The plot of land he works on is not his own, it belongs to his lord, who demands a significant portion of the harvest as rent. The feudal system is built on the backs of men like him, who work the land but own nothing. This system is rigid and unforgiving, leaving little room for personal freedom or improvement of one's station. The peasants or serfs are tied to the land, bound by law and custom to serve their lord in exchange for protection and the right to farm a small plot for their family. However, this protection is often more of a shackling obligation than a true benefit. The protagonist begins his labor, bending over rows of crops that need tending. The work is repetitive and grueling: plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting, tasks that require immense physical effort but bring little reward. Despite his dedication, the peasant knows that much of what he grows will not be for his family. Taxes are collected by the Lord's men, and tithes must be paid to the church, which, despite its spiritual promises, demands its share in the form of grain, livestock, or coin. Each year, these burdens increase, leaving less and less for the peasant to feed his own household. There is little chance of saving or accumulating wealth, and a single bad harvest could mean starvation for his entire family. As the day wears on, the protagonist and the other villagers speak in hushed tones of the collector's impending visit. The tax collector is an unwelcome figure, a man who represents both the feudal lord and the church. He arrives periodically to assess the harvest and collect the dues owed, and his visits are always accompanied by fear and anxiety. If the peasants fail to meet their quotas, they risk severe punishment, from fines and imprisonment to the confiscation of what little they own. For the protagonist, this looming presence is a constant reminder of the powerlessness of his position. He works tirelessly, yet he has no control over his own life. The conflict here is not just about survival, it is about the fundamental injustice of the system. The peasants labor endlessly, but their work benefits only the elite, the lords and the clergy, who live in comfort and security while the peasants struggle to make ends meet. The protagonist feels the weight of this injustice every day, knowing that his hard work will never lead to freedom or a better future. His life is dictated by forces beyond his control: the seasons, the whims of his lord, the weather, and the disease that ravages the village when times are hard. As the story progresses, this sense of conflict deepens, setting the stage for a climactic moment of rebellion or resignation to fate. The protagonist is caught in a system that values his labor but not his life, a system that keeps him trapped in poverty and servitude, with little hope for change. From dawn until dusk, the protagonist's life revolves around the fields. He works alongside his family, his wife and children, all toiling with him in the dirt. The land, while fertile, is unforgiving, and the tools they have are rudimentary: rusted scythes, wooden plows, and worn-out oxen that plod wearily through the earth. His back aches from years of bending over, and his hands are calloused and cracked from handling rough implements. The physical toll of his labor is evident, but there is no alternative. If he does not work, his family will not eat. The fields are divided into strips, some of which belong to the lord, and others are allotted to the peasants for their personal use. Yet, even these strips are not truly theirs. The peasants must work their lord's land first, ensuring that his fields are sown and harvested before they can tend to their own. Often, by the time they finish their duties to the lord, they are left with little energy or daylight to cultivate their personal crops. This leaves them in a precarious position,
Just one poor harvest could mean famine. And though they work tirelessly, their yield is often insufficient to meet the needs of their family, forcing them to ration their food carefully. Children go hungry, meals are sparse, and there is always the gnawing fear of starvation. The protagonist's motivation is simple: to keep his family alive another day. Every movement, every stroke of the scythe, is a bid to stave off hunger for just a little longer. Overseeing all of this labor is the Lord, a figure who lives in luxury in a nearby manor, far removed from the hardships of the peasants. Though the protagonist rarely sees him, the Lord's influence is omnipresent. The peasants are bound to his land, working not out of loyalty or choice but out of necessity and legal obligation. The Lord demands a significant portion of their harvest, leaving them with barely enough to survive on. Beyond the Lord's demands, the church also claims its due. The village priest, though a source of spiritual comfort, reminds the peasants of their religious obligations, including the tithe, a mandatory tax of 1/10 of their harvest to support the church. This tithe is collected regularly, and failure to comply could result in excommunication or worse. The protagonist feels the weight of these demands crushing him. After weeks of laboring in the fields, he watches helplessly as the fruits of his efforts are carted off to the Lord's granaries and the church's coffers. There is no sense of fairness in this system. The wealthier the Lord becomes, the more the peasants must give, perpetuating a cycle of poverty from which they cannot escape. Just as the peasants think they might survive another season, disaster strikes. A sudden shift in weather, perhaps an unseasonably early frost, a deluge of rain, or a blistering drought, devastates the crops. The protagonist stands helpless in the fields as he watches the crops wither or rot, his labor for the entire year unraveling in front of his eyes. The once promising fields, which had offered a glimmer of hope for a good harvest, are now barren. The climate, unpredictable and harsh, is yet another force beyond the protagonist's control, but one that has a direct impact on his life. Panic sets in among the villagers. They gather in the church to pray for divine intervention, but it is clear that no amount of faith can change the outcome. The fields, so carefully tended, are ruined, and the harvest will not be enough to meet the demands of the Lord, the church, or their own families. The peasants begin to whisper about past famines, recalling the dark times when entire villages were wiped out by starvation. For the protagonist, the future looks bleak. He must now face the grim reality of rationing what little they have, hoping to stretch the meager supplies until the next growing season. But in the back of his mind, he knows that the Lord and the church will still demand their share, whether or not the peasants can feed themselves. Compounding the hardships of labor and taxation, the village is frequently visited by illness. Disease is rampant among the peasants, exacerbated by poor nutrition, harsh living conditions, and a lack of medical knowledge. Plagues and fevers sweep through the village, leaving behind death and despair. The protagonist has lost many friends and family members to sickness over the years, and now he fears for his own children. The peasants live in close quarters, their homes little more than cramped, unsanitary huts that provide scant protection from the elements. This lack of proper shelter makes them vulnerable to every sickness that passes through the region. Children are especially at risk, their immune systems weakened by malnutrition. For the protagonist, every cough, every fever in his household is a source of terror, for he knows how quickly sickness can claim a life. Death is a constant companion, and premature loss is expected rather than surprising. The village graveyard is filled with the unmarked graves of those who died too young, their stories forgotten, their lives unnoticed by the world beyond the village. The protagonist's fragile existence teeters on the edge when a new tax collector arrives in the village. This figure is more imposing and ruthless than the previous one, representing both the Lord's increasing greed and the church's insatiable need for wealth. Unlike the old collector, who was at least somewhat familiar with the peasants and their hardships, this new enforcer is cold and calculated, his presence intimidating. He rides into the village flanked by soldiers, a stark reminder that rebellion or refusal to comply will be met with swift punishment. His arrival is a grim spectacle for the villagers, as they understand immediately that this man is not here to negotiate or show mercy. He is here to extract every last bit of value from their meager harvest. The villagers gather in silence as the tax collector begins his rounds. His demeanor is condescending, treating the peasants not as humans but as mere tools to be used by their feudal masters. When he reaches the protagonist's home, he inspects their harvest with a critical eye, his lip curling in disdain at the pitiful amount of grain and produce they've managed to gather. The protagonist and his wife stand in quiet desperation, hoping that the little they have will be enough to satisfy the collector and spare them further hardship. But the collector scoffs, declaring that the taxes this season have been increased due to the Lord's need for additional funds for a military campaign or a religious building project. He demands not only the expected tribute but an additional levy, pushing the family's already precarious situation into outright catastrophe. The protagonist's heart sinks as he tries to reason with the tax collector, explaining that the poor harvest, coupled with the ravages of disease, has left them with barely enough to feed themselves. The tax collector is unmoved. He orders that what little grain the family has be confiscated immediately, threatening to seize their livestock as well if they do not comply. The protagonist looks at his family, his wife's eyes filled with fear and his children, thin and pale, watching from the doorway. The weight of his failure to protect them crushes him, and a rising sense of injustice fills his chest. The protagonist knows that to give in would mean certain starvation for his family, but to resist would be to risk everything. In this moment, he is forced to confront the unbearable truth. The system he has been forced to live under will never allow him or his family to escape poverty. The final straw has been drawn, and the seeds of rebellion are planted in his mind. The pressure has been building for years, and now it reaches a boiling point. Driven by desperation and anger, the protagonist makes a decision that will change his life forever. He will no longer submit to the Lord's oppression. The night after the tax collector's visit, he meets secretly with a few other villagers who, like him, are fed up with their treatment. They speak in whispers, their words laced with both fear and determination. They discuss the possibility of rebellion, knowing full well the risks involved. The Lord's men-at-arms could easily crush them, and their families would be punished severely. But the alternative, continuing to live under such crushing oppression, seems just as unbearable. The rebellion begins with a simple yet daring act. The protagonist and his fellow villagers decide to refuse the Lord's demands. They agree to hide a portion of their grain and livestock, keeping it for themselves rather than offering it to the Lord or the church. It is a bold and dangerous move, but it gives the protagonist a sense of empowerment he has never felt before. For the first time, he feels in control of his fate, if only for a fleeting moment. However, the rebellion quickly escalates. Word of the villagers' refusal reaches the Lord's ears, and he responds with swift and brutal force. The protagonist knows that simply hiding the grain will not be enough. He rallies the villagers, urging them to take up arms, pitchforks, sickles, and anything else they can find, to defend themselves against the inevitable retaliation. Tensions reach their peak when the Lord's soldiers arrive in the village to enforce the collection of taxes. In a tense standoff, the protagonist stands at the forefront of the villagers, his face hard with resolve, his hands gripping a rusted scythe. The climax of the story comes as the soldiers attempt to forcibly take the villagers' grain. The protagonist, acting on impulse and years of pent-up frustration, attacks one of the soldiers, sparking a chaotic fight. The villagers, though outnumbered and poorly armed, fight back with desperation and fury. For a brief moment, it seems that they might succeed in driving off the soldiers. But the battle is short-lived. The Lord's men are better equipped and trained, and soon the rebellion is quashed. The protagonist fights valiantly, but he is overwhelmed, beaten to the ground, and captured. Bloodied and bruised, he is dragged before the Lord's steward, who coldly announces that the rebellion has failed. The village is left in ruins, and the consequences will be severe. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the village is a picture of defeat and despair. The uprising has been crushed, and the remaining villagers are forced to kneel in submission as the Lord's men restore order. The protagonist, though broken and wounded, is still defiant. He knows that his actions will lead to severe punishment, but in his heart, he feels that he has done the only thing a man in his position could do. He fought back against an unjust system, even if only for a fleeting moment of defiance. The Lord himself does not bother to come to the village, leaving the punishment to his steward, who declares that the leader of the rebellion, our protagonist, must be made an example of. In a public display of authority, the protagonist is sentenced to death, his execution meant to serve as a warning to any other peasants who might consider rebelling against their lords. As he stands before the gathered crowd, his wife and children among them, he does not beg for mercy. Instead, he looks out over the faces of his fellow villagers, many of whom had joined him in the rebellion, now cowed and defeated. He feels a deep sense of sorrow, not for himself, but for the systemic suffering that will continue long after his death. The execution is swift, but the memory of the rebellion lingers. Though the protagonist dies, his story does not end with him. His defiance, however brief, plants a seed of resistance in the minds of the other peasants. They may not act immediately, but they have seen that it is possible, however dangerous, to challenge the system.
His story spreads quietly among the villages, a whisper of hope that one day, perhaps, the peasants might rise again, stronger and more organized. The protagonist's rebellion becomes a symbol of the injustice that defines the feudal system and the unbreakable spirit of those who suffer under it. The village where the protagonist lives is typical of a medieval European settlement, especially in France or England during the 12th to 14th centuries. The village is small, perhaps home to around 100 to 200 people, and consists of simple thatched houses made of wood and wattle, with roofs of straw. These homes are dark and cramped, with earthen floors, a central hearth for cooking and warmth, and little in the way of furnishings. Only a few wooden benches, a table, and straw-filled mattresses for sleeping. Surrounding the village are fields of cultivated land, divided into strips that the peasants work communally. Some of these strips are held by the lord, and the peasants must toil here before tending to their own small plots of land. Beyond the fields lie common lands, where the villagers graze their animals. Cows, pigs, and chickens, another vital part of their subsistence. The fields are neatly organized into a patchwork of crop rotations, with barley, oats, and wheat being the main staples. At the heart of the village is the church, not just a place of worship but the center of community life. Its bell tolls at important moments, marking the start of the working day, calling people to Mass, and ringing for village meetings or in times of crisis. The church is a simple stone structure, but its importance to the peasants cannot be overstated. It stands as a physical and spiritual center, representing both hope and authority in their lives. Surrounding the village, the landscape is dotted with forests and rivers, often seen as both resources and mysterious, dangerous places filled with wolves and spirits, according to the villagers' beliefs. Catholicism permeates every aspect of life. The villagers' days are structured around the church calendar, with frequent holy days, feast days, and periods of fasting. The priest is a significant figure in the village, not just as a spiritual leader but also as a mediator between the peasants and the divine. Every action in the fields, from sowing to harvesting, is accompanied by prayers for divine protection and a good yield. The villagers believe deeply in superstition, that bad weather, disease, or a poor harvest could be a sign of divine displeasure, or worse, the work of malevolent spirits or witches. Religious rituals mark key moments in the peasant's life. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals are conducted under the church's watchful eye. Every Sunday, the villagers attend Mass, where the priest preaches about humility, obedience, and the rewards of the afterlife for those who endure their hardships faithfully. The church also holds relics, believed to be pieces of saints or objects touched by them, which the villagers venerate, hoping for miracles. Despite their deep religious convictions, the villagers also maintain an undercurrent of pagan traditions, remnants of older beliefs. Festivals like midsummer or harvest celebrations are often imbued with ancient customs, such as lighting bonfires to ward off evil spirits or leaving offerings for local deities to ensure a good crop. The technology of the High Middle Ages is rudimentary but essential to the survival of the peasants. They rely heavily on manual labor and the use of draft animals, such as oxen and horses, to plow the fields. The most common tool is the heavy plow, which, while not efficient by modern standards, is crucial for breaking up the thick soil of the northern European landscape. The plowshare cuts deep into the earth, turning it over for planting, but it requires immense physical effort to operate. Agricultural techniques are basic but effective, with the practice of crop rotation helping to keep the soil fertile. This involves planting different crops in a three-field system. One field lies fallow, one is planted with a winter crop, and the third with a spring crop. This system helps prevent soil exhaustion, though it leaves the peasants vulnerable if one of the crops fails. Water mills are used in some areas to grind grain into flour, a significant innovation that saves time and effort, though access to such technology depends on the wealth and foresight of the local lord. Construction techniques are similarly basic. The peasants' homes are built from wood, mud, and wattle and daub, with roofs made from thatch. These buildings provide little insulation, meaning the peasants suffer greatly during the harsh winters, relying on firewood gathered from the forests to stay warm. The economy of the village is based on agriculture and servitude, with little opportunity for trade or profit. The peasants do not own the land they work. Instead, they lease it from the lord in exchange for labor. They are part of the feudal system, a rigid hierarchy in which the peasants are at the bottom, tied to the land by law and custom. The vast majority of what they produce is given to the lord as rent, while a portion is also owed to the church as a tithe. This leaves the peasants with barely enough to sustain themselves. Markets are controlled by the lord, and any surplus goods the peasants manage to produce must be sold there, often at prices dictated by the lord's steward.
The manorial system * ensures that the peasants remain dependent on the lord for protection and the right to work the land. And even if a peasant manages to save a little, there is little hope of improving their station. Feudal lords, like the one in this story, hold immense power over the peasants. They control the land, dictate the peasants' work schedules, and can levy fines or other punishments as they see fit. The lord's primary concern is extracting as much wealth from his estate as possible, whether that means taxing the peasants or selling their grain at a profit. His authority is absolute within the boundaries of his land, though he, too, is subject to the king or regional noble above him. However, for the peasants, the king is a distant and almost mythical figure, whose influence rarely touches their daily lives. The church is the other great power in the village. Bishops and priests wield spiritual authority, but they also have immense political and economic influence. The church controls large swathes of land and is exempt from many of the taxes levied on the laity, meaning that the peasants must support both their lord and the church. The king, though the ultimate ruler, is a distant figure whose policies rarely impact the daily life of the villagers directly, except through wars or heavy taxation. By the 14th century, tensions between the peasants and the feudal lords begin to reach a breaking point. In many parts of Europe, there are peasant revolts, the most famous being the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. Led by figures like Wat Tyler, this uprising was a direct response to oppressive taxation and feudal obligations. Although it was ultimately crushed, the revolt set the stage for future movements toward greater social justice. The protagonists' rebellion, though smaller in scale, echoes the growing unrest among the peasantry throughout Europe. The grinding oppression, the unfair taxation, and the sense of injustice felt by the peasants create fertile ground for resistance. These revolts often failed, but they signaled the beginning of the end for the feudal system, as future generations would continue to push for freedom from the feudal lord's control. One of the central themes of this story is the power imbalance between the feudal lord and the serfs. The protagonist and his fellow peasants exist at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, bound by law and tradition to serve their lord, who controls their land, labor, and, by extension, their lives. The peasants are seen not as individuals but as mere instruments of production, valued only for their ability to work the fields and generate wealth for the lord. This relationship is deeply exploitative, as the peasants must hand over a significant portion of their crops and earnings to the lord while receiving very little in return. They live in constant fear of the lord's punishments, whether through fines, imprisonment, or the seizure of land. This dynamic represents the larger structure of feudalism, where power is concentrated in the hands of the few, and the vast majority of the population is oppressed and exploited. The story highlights the dehumanization that comes with such power dynamics, showing how the peasants' lives are reduced to little more than survival, with no possibility of advancement or freedom. Religion plays a dual role in the story, serving as both a source of spiritual comfort and a tool of economic exploitation. For the peasants, the Catholic Church is a central part of their daily lives. They attend Mass, observe holy days, and pray for protection and salvation, believing that their suffering in this world will be rewarded in the next. The priest is a respected figure in the village, offering guidance and interpreting the will of God for the peasants. However, the church is also complicit in the oppression of the peasantry. It demands tithes, a mandatory tax of 1/10 of all produce, and exercises considerable control over the peasants' lives. The church owns large swaths of land and benefits from the labor of the peasants, much like the feudal lord. While it preaches humility and charity, in practice, it is a powerful economic force that contributes to the peasants' hardships. This tension between the church's role as a spiritual leader and its economic exploitation of the peasants is a key theme in the story. The protagonist's internal struggle with his faith mirrors the broader conflict within medieval society, where the church's moral authority was often in conflict with its material wealth and power. The story questions whether the promises of salvation can justify the church's role in perpetuating the suffering of the peasantry. The Middle Ages were a time of limited intellectual freedom, with most of the available knowledge controlled by the church. The protagonist's world is one where philosophical and scientific advancements are scarce, and those that do exist are often constrained by religious doctrine. The peasants are taught that their place in life is divinely ordained, and questioning the status quo is seen as both dangerous and sinful. However, there are small signs of intellectual growth even in this rigid environment. In monasteries and universities, scholars are beginning to explore new ideas, slowly planting the seeds of what would later become the Renaissance. While the protagonist and his fellow peasants have little access to this knowledge, the narrative touches on the potential for change that exists beneath the surface. The story subtly explores the idea that even in a world dominated by tradition and superstition, the human desire for understanding cannot be entirely suppressed. This slow shift in thinking foreshadows the eventual decline of the feudal system and the rise of more enlightened ideas about the world and humanity's place in it. The peasants live in a world largely isolated from the elite classes that rule over them. Their interactions with the nobility are limited to moments of taxation, labor, or punishment, and they rarely, if ever, experience the luxuries or culture of the higher classes. However, there are subtle cultural exchanges that occur through the church and through occasional encounters with travelers, merchants, or members of the clergy who bring news from distant lands. The narrative hints at these cultural clashes. The peasants may hear rumors of courtly life, chivalry, and scholarly debates, but these ideas feel distant and irrelevant to their daily struggles. Yet, through the church, they are also exposed to the broader world. The church is a conduit for international influences, as priests and bishops often have connections to the papacy in Rome or other regions of Europe. The peasants hear of crusades in the Holy Land, of far-off cities like Jerusalem or Constantinople, and of events that seem beyond their comprehension but nonetheless shape their world indirectly. These cultural exchanges are often filtered through the lens of religion, but they represent a form of cross-cultural interaction that hints at the broader global dynamics of the medieval period. The story explores how the peasants, despite their isolation, are not entirely disconnected from the rest of the world, even if they experience it in fragmented, indirect ways. The social and economic challenges of the medieval peasant are numerous and overwhelming. Famine is a constant threat, especially in years when the harvest is poor or the weather turns against them. The narrative explores the misery of living in a state of perpetual scarcity, where even a minor setback, such as a disease outbreak, a bad storm, or a demand for higher taxes, can spell disaster for an entire family. Infant mortality is also a grim reality. Many peasant children do not survive past infancy due to poor nutrition, disease, and the harsh living conditions. The protagonist's personal experience with the loss of children underscores the fragility of life in this period and the constant grief that families endure. The peasants have little hope of social mobility. They are born into poverty and will die in poverty, with no opportunity to rise beyond their station. This hopelessness is a pervasive theme in the story, emphasizing the brutality of the feudal system. Despite these hardships, there is also a theme of resilience. The peasants find ways to survive, to hold on to hope, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Their ability to endure famine, death, and oppression is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The story does not shy away from the harsh realities of medieval life, but it also highlights the courage and tenacity of those who lived through it. In medieval society, gender roles were rigidly defined, yet the labor of women was essential to the survival of the household. The protagonist's wife plays a central role in the narrative, representing the often overlooked contributions of female peasants. She works alongside her husband in the fields, performing the same grueling tasks, while also bearing the additional burden of domestic responsibilities. She is responsible for cooking, cleaning, and caring for the children, in addition to contributing to the household's economic survival through her labor in the fields and gathering food from the surrounding woods. The medieval world, especially for peasants, was filled with tangible experiences, and capturing these through vivid descriptions draws the audience into the protagonist's reality. The story begins at dawn, and we immediately smell the earth, damp from the morning dew, as the protagonist steps out of his humble cottage. The scent of freshly turned soil mixes with the familiar staleness of the peasant's simple clothing, worn from years of labor. The soundscape is equally important. The rhythmic toll of the church bell marking the passage of time, the distant lowing of oxen, and the soft whisper of the wind across the fields. These sensory cues create a fully immersive world, where the audience can almost feel the cold bite of winter on their skin during long, dark nights, or hear the crackling of the fire as the protagonist and his family huddle close for warmth. He may think about the future of his children, realizing with despair that they, too, are destined to live the same life of servitude unless something changes. These reflections are filled with a sense of resignation, an understanding that he, like so many before him, is trapped in a system that offers no escape. Yet, there is also a flicker of hope or rebellion, a realization that perhaps his life could mean more if he fought back, even if only in a small way. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 serves as an important backdrop for understanding the growing dissatisfaction and unrest among the lower classes during this period. While the protagonist's village may be geographically removed from the center of the rebellion, the ripple effects of the revolt reach even the most remote regions. This revolt, led by figures like Wat Tyler, was a direct response to unjust taxation, particularly the poll tax, and the broader oppressive feudal system. Though the revolt was ultimately crushed, it signaled the increasing frustration of peasants who were beginning to question their place in the feudal hierarchy.
The rumors of rebellion reach the protagonist's village, whispered about in secret meetings after dark. The peasants, though initially afraid of reprisal, begin to see the revolt as a symbol of hope. The protagonist, upon hearing about the bravery of the rebels, starts to envision a world where peasants could stand up against their lords. Though the protagonist's rebellion is smaller in scale and less organized, it is part of a broader movement of peasant resistance across Europe. The famine that devastated much of Europe during the 14th century also plays a crucial role in the narrative. Repeated years of poor harvests, caused by a combination of adverse weather and plague, left the peasants on the brink of starvation. The famine exacerbated existing tensions between the peasants and the ruling classes, as the lords continued to demand their dues despite the widespread scarcity of food. For the protagonist, the threat of famine is ever present. Each harvest holds the possibility of disaster, and the fear of starvation looms large in his mind. When the crops fail, and the taxes increase, the protagonist's desperation reaches a breaking point, fueling his decision to resist the system that keeps him in perpetual poverty. Daily life is defined by simplicity and scarcity. The diet of the medieval peasant is basic and repetitive, consisting mainly of bread made from coarse grain, vegetables, and occasionally some beans or lentils. Meat is a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions or when the family can catch a rabbit or other small game in the woods. The bread itself is often dark and dense, made from barley or rye rather than the finer wheat reserved for the lords. Occasionally, the protagonist and his family might eat a thin broth or porridge, but meals are sparse, especially during times of poor harvest. Malnutrition is common, and the lack of variety in their diet takes a toll on their health. Clothing is equally simple. The protagonist and his family wear coarse garments made from wool and linen, which are often homemade or passed down through generations. The colors are dull, browns, grays, and greens, reflecting the natural dyes available to the peasants. The fabric is rough against the skin, and the clothing offers little protection against the cold during the harsh winter months. In contrast, the lords and clergy wear finely woven fabrics in rich colors, a constant reminder of the social divide. Shoes are made from leather, often patched and repaired to extend their life, but many peasants go barefoot in the warmer months to preserve what little they have. The homes of the peasants are rudimentary, built from wood, wattle, and daub, with thatch roofs that often leak when it rains. Inside, the living conditions are cramped, with the entire family sharing one or two rooms. A central hearth provides both heat and a place to cook, but the smoke often fills the room due to the lack of a proper chimney. Furniture is sparse, perhaps a wooden table, some stools, and straw-filled mattresses for sleeping. The floor is dirt, and there is little protection from the elements. Despite these harsh conditions, the home is a place of family connection, where the protagonist and his family share stories, prayers, and what little food they have at the end of the day. One of the most important artifacts in the village is the church bell, which acts as the timekeeper for the entire community. Its deep, resonant sound marks the beginning of the workday, the call to Mass, and the end of the day's labor. It also rings on holy days and for important village events such as weddings, funerals, and feasts. For the protagonist and the other peasants, the bell is a constant presence in their lives, dictating the rhythm of their days and serving as a reminder of both God's omnipresence and the authority of the church. The sound of the bell often triggers moments of reflection for the protagonist. When it tolls in the morning, it pulls him from his sleep, signaling another day of hard labor ahead. When it rings for vespers in the evening, it provides a brief moment of respite, a time to stop working and pray, even though the prayers often feel hollow as hunger gnaws at him. The bell's toll during a funeral service for a fellow peasant drives home the fragility of life in the medieval world. The bell thus becomes not just a tool of timekeeping but a symbol of the divine order, a reminder that the peasants' lives are dictated by forces both human and celestial. Once a year, the village holds its annual fair, a rare opportunity for the peasants to step outside their everyday routines and engage with a world beyond their small community. The fair is a lively event, filled with colorful stalls, merchants, and entertainers. For many peasants, it's the only time they can sell their goods, surplus grain, wool, or handmade crafts, and perhaps earn a little extra money. The fair is also a time of social interaction, where villagers can meet people from neighboring towns, hear news from distant lands, and trade stories. In the story, the annual fair provides a brief glimmer of hope for the protagonist. For a day, he can momentarily forget the grinding oppression of his daily life, enjoying the music, food, and camaraderie that the fair brings. It's also a time for him to dream of what life might be like if he could escape the feudal system. Perhaps he hears tales of cities where men can work for themselves, or rumors of distant lands where the lord's reach is not as oppressive.
These moments of hope, however fleeting, give the protagonist the strength to continue his struggle. One of the few technological advancements that the peasants benefit from is the watermill, used to grind grain into flour. The introduction of watermills in medieval villages marked a significant shift in agricultural efficiency. Instead of laboriously grinding grain by hand using millstones, the peasants can take their grain to the Lord's mill, where it is processed more quickly and efficiently. However, the mill is yet another point of economic exploitation, as the Lord charges a fee for its use, taking a percentage of the peasant's grain as payment. The watermill symbolizes both progress and control. While it makes the peasants' work easier, it also reinforces their dependence on the Lord, who owns the mill and dictates its usage. The protagonist may feel a mix of relief and resentment each time he brings his grain to the mill. Relief because the task is made easier, and resentment because he knows that part of his hard-earned harvest will be taken by the Lord. The mechanical sound of the mill's grinding stones, echoing through the valley, serves as a constant reminder of the Lord's dominion over every aspect of the peasants' lives, even their technological advancements. In the High Middle Ages, though life in a remote European village may seem isolated, the world beyond was experiencing significant cultural exchanges and global events that, albeit indirectly, influenced even the most rural communities. These connections, although often limited by the vast distances and communication challenges of the time, introduced new ideas, products, and practices that subtly shaped the feudal world. The story of the protagonist takes place against this broader global context, where trade routes, political conflicts, and religious movements created ripples that reached even the smallest of villages. While medieval European peasants lived largely self-sufficient lives, focused on agriculture and local economies, the broader world was interconnected through trade and cultural exchanges. European villages, including the one where our protagonist lives, occasionally came into contact with foreign goods and new ideas, often brought by merchants traveling along established trade routes. Arab and Byzantine merchants, in particular, were key players in this network, acting as intermediaries between the East and West. They brought luxury goods like spices, silks, and glassware from the East to Europe, commodities that were far beyond the reach of peasants but were desired by the nobility and church. Though the protagonist may never see these goods firsthand, their presence in the Lord's manor or the church would serve as a constant reminder of the wider world beyond the village. Perhaps he hears rumors of distant lands from travelers who pass through during the annual fair, telling tales of cities in the East where scholars and artisans thrive, or of merchants who sail from ports in the Mediterranean, laden with gold, ivory, and pearls. These connections, though faint, expose the villagers to the notion that their world, small as it may seem, is part of a much larger, more complex global network. The church itself acted as a conduit for these global connections. Relics from the Holy Land, brought back by crusaders, were often displayed in local churches, imbuing the religious practices of the village with a sense of global spirituality. The peasants, although primarily concerned with their own survival, were thus indirectly connected to the wider Christian world, with its pilgrimages, relics, and tales of distant lands where battles were fought in the name of God. The Crusades, a series of religious wars between European Christians and Muslim forces in the Holy Land, had a significant global impact on Europe, including its feudal system. Although the protagonist's village is far from the battlefields of Jerusalem, the effects of the Crusades still trickle down to the peasantry in subtle ways. Lords, inspired by religious fervor or the desire for wealth and glory, often left their estates to fight in these wars, leaving stewards to manage their lands. This might provide a temporary respite for the peasants from direct feudal oversight, but it also introduced instability, as absentee lords demanded even greater tribute to finance their expeditions. The Crusades also introduced new cultural influences to Europe, as returning knights and merchants brought back exotic goods, knowledge, and technological advancements from the Islamic world. Items like damask cloth, Persian rugs, and sugar made their way into European markets, while Islamic scholarship in fields such as mathematics, astronomy, and medicine slowly filtered into Europe through translated texts. The cross-pollination of ideas, whether architectural, culinary, or scientific, enriched European culture, even if peasants like the protagonist were only marginally aware of these influences. Additionally, the military techniques and fortification designs learned during the Crusades influenced the construction of castles and manor houses in Europe. The protagonist might see new stone fortifications rising in the Lord's manor, inspired by Middle Eastern fortresses. These developments, while distant from the peasants' daily lives, subtly shifted the social and political structures of the world they lived in, adding layers of complexity to the already rigid feudal system. While the peasants in Western Europe lived under a feudal system that heavily emphasized serfdom, the situation was different in other parts of the world. In the Byzantine Empire, for example, peasants, though still largely tied to the land, had a somewhat more flexible relationship with their lords. Byzantine peasants had the opportunity to participate in local governance through the village commune system, and while they still paid taxes to both the state and the church, their relationship with the land was not as rigidly bound by feudal obligations as in Western Europe. Meanwhile, in the Abbasid Caliphate, which covered parts of the Middle East and North Africa, the peasants worked under a different economic and social system. Although landowners still held significant power, there was a greater emphasis on urbanization and trade, and the agricultural economy was more integrated into a broader network of commercial exchange. Irrigation systems in the Fertile Crescent allowed for more efficient farming, and the concept of labor specialization was more advanced, with peasants able to participate in a broader range of economic activities. In contrast to the relative isolation of Western European villages, many regions in the Islamic world, particularly under the Abbasids, were part of thriving urban centers connected by trade routes stretching across Africa, Asia, and Europe. Peasants in these regions often had access to larger markets, where they could sell their produce and participate in global commerce. The story can subtly contrast the static agrarian lifestyle of the protagonist with these more fluid and dynamic economies elsewhere, emphasizing the particular hardships of European peasants, who were often more isolated and more strictly bound to their land. Additionally, gender roles in these regions varied. While women in Western European peasant communities were confined to domestic and agricultural work, women in Byzantium and certain parts of the Islamic world could engage in commerce and sometimes even wield political influence, particularly in urban settings. This comparison highlights the regional diversity of medieval life, underscoring how geography, religion, and politics shaped the experiences of peasants in different parts of the world.